Hi, I'm Micah Halpern, and thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is tunnels. Not just any tunnels, the tunnels specifically that Hamas has been utilizing for their weapon against Israel. But tunnels, since their inception, have been used in war. They are almost impossible to defend against. They are extremely effective as a weapon. They always allow for surprise. They permit fast escape. The advantage is across the board, consistently with those who use the tunnels. And Hamas was not the first and will not be the last to use tunnels. There is, as of now, no good defense system against tunnels. Israel has begun to develop a defense system and may well have the very first anti-tunnel defense technology. More on that later. But Israel is learning how to properly engage with the threat of tunnels. It's extremely problematic and very, very difficult. For several years, even before this conflict with Hamas, between Israel and Hamas, Israel knew that they needed a serious anti-tunnel plan. They spent tens of millions of dollars training teams of recruits, conscripts, not reservists, conscripts, from this concept of invading tunnels, invaders that might break through underground and come into Israel itself. Now, it's important because the details, the nitty-gritty of tunnel warfare is very, very dangerous. It requires a whole new mindset, a whole new worldview. So Israel knew that they would be fighting against tunnels, whether it be in the north with Hezbollah, or that's in southern Lebanon, or in the south with Gaza and Hamas. And these two places were very important because Hezbollah had already effectively used tunnels, not to get into Israel with, but actually to hide in terms of their labyrinth of safety and security. These are extremely special units that were created by Israel in order to defend against and fight these tunnels. One group was in the Golani Brigade, and the other was in the Givati Brigade. And you should know that these brigades were also very elite, but within those brigades there was a very small group only focusing on tunnel warfare. The first record I have about tunnels is actually found in the Bible. I know that sounds strange. We are on Shalom TV, of course, but it is the first record I have of tunnel warfare. It's found in 2 Samuel, the 5th chapter, verse 8. I translate it, and then I'm going to give you King James translation. But the translation is actually problematic, and you'll see. The translation goes something like this. And David said on that day, whoever strikes the Jebusite and goes through the tzinor is the Hebrew word found in that verse. King James, though, says, and David said on that day, whoever getteth up to the gutter and smiteth the Jebusite, the lame and the blind. In other words, he calls it the gutter. Tzinor might mean water channel, it might mean gutter, it might mean tube. Whatever it is, David himself goes to Jebus and has his commanders and says to them, go up through the tzinor. The tzinor is probably the first method of tunnel warfare, where they slip through that tzinor, through that water channel, through the gutter, whatever you would call it, and David ends up conquering Jebus. And he then renames Jebus Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the name of that town, and that becomes the capital of his nation now, which is a very important concept historically within the Jewish people. That's how Jerusalem came into existence, through a tunnel. Some refer to Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem as that tunnel. That's doubtful, because historically it just doesn't make sense. Also in terms of the nature of it. But you should know something. The concept is still there, whether it be Hezekiah's tunnel or whether it be this one from 2 Samuel. Most probably this is what happened. Water sources were often outside the city because they were in the valley. And so what would happen is the city would cover up to protect their water source from invaders, because invaders would probably poison the water source or create some sort of problem, or even go in through the water source and up into the city itself. So what the city would do is they would draw back the water into the walls from the water source itself outside, creating these tunnels. They would cover up the water source, though, to prevent their invaders from taking advantage of it. It was really problematic. So it's very interesting, and that's probably what happened in Jerusalem itself, the first example of tunnel warfare. Another great example, also dealing with Jewish history, because after all, we're dealing with the Jewish network here, is the great Roman legion. They were nearly powerless against the tunnels. Bar Kokhba and his revolt with Rabbi Akiva against Rome used tunnels, deep underground tunnels. But the Romans actually were able to combat it, but very rudimentarily. They used smoke to smoke out the rebels. In other words, when they went down there, they were ill-prepared. They chased into the tunnels after the rebels, and they ended up that they were wearing armor. The armor was too long, too big, too heavy. They had long weapons, long swords. Those kinds of things were totally inappropriate in tunnel warfare. So what happened is that they went into the tunnels equipped improperly. Their long sword and lance were not helpful to them. They needed light and short swords. And that's what happened. Actually, you should note, that's how Israel retrained its special commandos I was talking to you about, with separate weapons, different weapons, geared for hand-to-hand combat and quick use in the tunnels themselves. Rome was so impressed by the labyrinth of tunnels that they created their own labyrinth under Rome to protect and enable proper defense of the city. The Afghans used them, the Chinese used them, the North Koreans used them, the Vietnamese used them, the Japanese used them. World War I was replete with them. World War II also, the Germans used them. Tunnels are involved in the history of war almost everywhere, even in the ghettos. I'm speaking about, obviously, the ghettos of the Holocaust. And this you should know, in other words, it's important. The Jews used tunnels. They used the sewers. Those are tunnels. Children were able to get in and out of the tunnels, in and out of those sewers. They were in and out and navigating out. They brought in weapons and food. They didn't use them to escape. They used them fundamentally to be a part, to empower the people of the ghetto itself. That famous picture of the boy with his hands up in the air in the Warsaw Ghetto, and the Nazis are shaking his body, and coming out of his clothes are vegetables, potatoes and carrots and all kinds of things. He had smuggled them in to the ghetto. They didn't use the sewers to escape. They used the sewers to bring in food and nutrition and weapons and information about what was going on. And as a result, just as an aside, the children who were involved in the sewers became the most powerful forces within the ghetto itself, because they had access to the things that were so valuable, weapons and food. Hamas has three kinds of tunnels, three. They have Gaza tunnels to Egypt, they have Gaza tunnels to Israel, and they have Gaza city tunnels within the city itself. So three kinds of tunnels. Egypt has said that they have destroyed thousands of tunnels. They flood them and they gas them. They have found most of the big ones, but there are still some smaller ones, and people have begun to dig new ones also. They exist. The big ones are huge. Imagine a single tube of the Holland Tunnel, let's say, for instance, with hundreds of roots coming out of it and hundreds of branches on top. So what you have is not just a tunnel system, the huge big tunnel, you actually have these tributaries and on top and bottom where they actually connect with one another. They're tunnels that actually relate to one another, and there are hundreds of outlets all over the place. So if you just find one, it's not destroying the tunnels themselves, not the network. The network is up and destroyed. They are big enough to drive trucks through, cars through. That's how big. A truck can be bought in Egypt and then shipped through a Gaza tunnel into Gaza itself. Egypt destroyed the big ones and the ones that trucks and cars can go through. The ones from Gaza into Israel, most of those have also been destroyed. Israel's destroyed them. That was the objective of the ground offensive. Israel's objective was to destroy the ones going into Israel. 32 big ones they destroyed, and dozens of small ones. The ones under Gaza City, though, are very complex. They're as big as the Pentagon's war room. You can imagine that? It can house to sleep 300 to 1,000 beds. Food, chefs, showers, water, ventilation, communication systems, editing bays. They're running their entire PR campaign from underneath the ground, underneath Gaza. That was not an objective of Israel when they began their war operation in the recent conflict with Gaza and Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Israel. Everything they need to command and control and live, they have underneath. Everything. Egypt has found, as well as Israel has found, that there are several methods to deal with the tunnels. The Egyptians, let's say, for instance, flooded them. They flood them with water, and they send gas down through them also. Smoke is exactly what the Romans did originally. So the Egyptians are also following suit, as well as the Israelis. But water really doesn't hold well. It just turns it into mud. Israel is actually developing a system, a technology which will allow them to detect tunnels as they're building it. It's a seismic kind of response, where they're putting sensors into the ground and allowing them to hear the tunnel technology as they're building them. But it doesn't help you find the tunnels. Finding the tunnels is a bigger problem. So Israel also was sending pressurized gas through, and then you'll see plumes of smoke on the other end where the exits come out. It's a fascinating technology, a fascinating issue of history. But indeed, we might find a technology for the first time ever, a sophisticated technology to fight and combat tunnels. Coming up next, points of view. Here's what some important voices have been talking about. First up is a column by Deborah Lippstadt called Why Jews Are Worried from the New York Times. Now, Lippstadt is a historian at Emory University. Her expertise is on Holocaust, especially Holocaust denial. Actually, her PhD dissertation is from Brandeis, and it was on U.S. press coverage during the Holocaust. She's a dynamic thinker. She's an exciting person, a very, very engaging personality and thinker. Remember, she and her publisher Penguin were sued for libel in England by a Holocaust denier, David Irving, because of a book she wrote, Denying the Holocaust, it was called, Denying the Holocaust. It was a long case, but truth prevailed in the end. You see, libel laws are different in the United Kingdom. The burden of proof there is on the plaintiff. But in the end, she and Penguin came out victorious, and actually truth prevailed there. She writes here about the growing trend of anti-Semitism in Europe. She says that it's not like Europe before the Holocaust, but there is still need to worry. Quote, it's still pretty bad. Lippstadt begins with humor, which I love, of course, because I love humor, and good humor especially. She begins with a Yiddish joke. She says, an old Jewish joke goes like this. What's the definition of a Jewish telegram? Start worrying, details to follow. She writes, I'm often asked by fellow Jews about the contemporary manifestation of anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe. Is this 1939? Are we on the cusp of another Holocaust? Until now, my answer has been an unequivocal no. She explains that things are changing. She writes, 70 years after the Holocaust, many Jews in Europe no longer feel safe. She concludes, the telegram has arrived. That is going back to her initial joke. The telegram has arrived. Jews are worrying. It is time for those who value free, democratic, open, multicultural, and enlightened society to do so too. This is not another Holocaust, but it is bad enough. The second column is by a character named Shmuel Rosner. Now, Rosner's article is also in the New York Times. It's called Israel's Fair Weather Fans. It comes from August 8th, 2014, and it should be no surprise, you should note, that the New York Times is publishing important essays about Jewish issues that we need to discuss. I say that despite the fact that many people have enormous frustration with the New York Times and thinks that they have a point of view which is problematic. That said, the New York Times really believes that these issues are important to discuss. And I, by the way, believe it's important for me, at least, to read them. Rosner is a very thoughtful writer. He's a political editor of the Jewish Journal and a fellow at the Jewish People's Policy Institute. He used to be at Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post. He's a regular op-ed writer and a contributor to both of those papers, as well as a lot of other places. He's out there. His ideas are there. He's got a lot of pithy points of view. He really is substantial. Now, he represents a component of liberal Zionism coming out of Israel. And I chose this piece because it is not, repeat, not the piece from a recent Sunday New York Times weekend piece, by Anthony Lerman entitled The End of Liberal Zionism, where Lerman bemoans the fact that liberal Israelis do not see things the way the diaspora Jews see things. And that is really problematic. In other words, and there's this tension. He says, Lerman says, well, it's about time that they come to understand liberal ideas the way we do. Rosner takes it on, even before this was even written, Rosner takes it on and says, just a moment. Israeli liberals are still liberals, but they choose life over death. Rosner begins by quoting an Israeli song. The Israeli song, Ein li eretz acheret, is a curious tune. I have no other country, go the lyrics, even if my land is on fire, unquote. So Rosner begins with this unbelievable song, and then he continues by saying, it's hard to find a Jewish Israeli who does not identify with it. Lefty Israelis interpret it as a protest song. It was sung at demonstrations against the 1982 Lebanon War and vigils following the 1995 assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Rosner warns, and this is a big deal, he warns American Jewish liberals, saying that U.S. and Israel are friends. And then he says, if they, that is American Jewish liberals, aim to erode the support, they should remember that Israel has managed in the past to make do even with a weakened American support. He ends by saying the following: Israel's critics clearly believe that Israel would be safer if the country adopted their prescribed liberal policies. That might be true, but it makes no difference. On matters of life and death, Israelis are going to make their own decisions. If they lose the support of some liberal Jews over it, that would be regrettable, but so be it. Israel will have to learn to survive without that support, and I'm certain that they will. Rosner wants to make it very clear to American liberals and to diaspora liberal Jews that as much as he and his liberal Israeli colleagues are still liberal and want to remain liberal, that Israeli leaders are making decisions based on a reality, not on ideals. And the need to stay alive is primary. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. The first cartoon is by Bruce Planty. Now, in the Tulsa world, it is very funny. A terrorist is standing on rubble, stones all around him. A big stone right next to him reads Gaza. And the terrorist has one foot in the air and his hand up gesticulating. And the caption reads, "And let this be a lesson to you, Israel." Now this is funny. Why is it funny? Because we laugh automatically. But it's funny because how can Hamas call what they're doing a victory? And why would they continue to go about bringing destruction onto themselves and the civilians living in the region, in Gaza itself? It doesn't make sense to me. And so Planty actually comes out with this spectacular line, "Let this be a lesson to you, Israel," so to speak, in their destruction, where Israel is not suffering the way the Gazans are suffering. That's important to see. The second cartoon has to do with ISIS, or IS, that is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State as it's called today. It's a caliphate. We've spoken about this in the past. This is deeply connected to the entire region, because ISIS, going unchecked, could potentially threaten not just the Middle East, everything, including Israel's very existence, because there is ISIS actually all over the place, including in Gaza right now. Now, this cartoon is done by a guy named Bach. It's part of the Creators Syndicate. There is a huge ISIS tank, enormous. And on the tank, it's written, "Made in the USA." Standing in front of the tank is a Kurdish fighter, and he has a bandana, and he's holding a machine gun that also reads, "Made in the USA." And what we have here is the parallel. It's tremendously upsetting. The US has given the Kurds small weapons in order to try to fight. But ISIS took hundreds of millions of US weapons that were given to the Iraqi army, and then the Iraqi army abandoned it as ISIS came into Mosul. Hundreds of millions of dollars, which includes tanks, armored personnel carriers, ammo, everything they could possibly want, including drones, you name it, as well as they stole $1 billion+ from the banks there. So ISIS has US tanks and much, much more. And the Kurds have a few machine guns. That's sad, very sad. The third cartoon is from the Atlanta Journal by Mike Lukovich. Now, it depicts two al-Qaeda terrorists reading a newspaper. The paper's headlines read, "Journalists beheaded, civilians massacred, children killed." And then one al-Qaeda terrorist says to the other, "Those ISIS dudes are monsters." And indeed, the artist is actually saying, and saying very clearly, the obvious. What's the obvious? That even al-Qaeda rejects the kind of brutality of ISIS. ISIS split off from al-Qaeda because al-Qaeda told them to control themselves in their violence, and they just couldn't do it. They couldn't control themselves. In a moment, my own perspective and a few predictions. I want to think out loud with you now. Israel has suffered a tremendous economic blow due to this conflict with Hamas. Tremendous. Just to give you some numbers to get a sense of this, there have been so far, just in July, 3,000 personal damage claims submitted to the Israel Tax Authority, where they will get tax rebates from these things, which has so far paid out some $20 million in direct damages, another $21 million for missed work days, other indirect damages. This estimate just goes for the month of July itself. Tourism in July alone dropped 26%. Estimated by tourism ministry, let's say for instance, the ministry itself, the estimate is that there will be $565 million loss this summer due to, that's $500 million due to this crisis with Hamas. There's been a huge impact on tourism, but also due to the FAA shutting down carriers and preventing them from coming to Israel. Ben Gurion Airport was virtually empty. Only El Al and British Air flew. No surprise that business in the south of Israel was hit hardest, probably with an estimated loss of $400 million so far, because they're in the epicenter of the crisis. They're right there in the middle. These losses will only increase, and it's really hard to build back up once you've been destroyed. The hardest is always the beginning, and this is just the beginning of those losses. It's not a recession, but it is a serious setback. We've thought out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@shalomtv.com. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. But before we end, let me leave you with one picante piece of information. Did you know that Hebrew numerology is called gematria? Every letter has a numerical value. Aleph equals 1, Bet equals 2, Gimel equals 3. Chai, for instance, is Chet, 8, plus Yud, 10, which equals 18. Double Chai, Chai is life, of course, right? Life is 36. But where does the word gematria come from? That's interesting. It's actually Greek. It's not Hebrew at all. It explains what gematria is. You see, gamma in Greek is the third letter of the Greek alphabet. And tri means 3. Tria is 3. Gematria. So gematria actually means the third letter of the alphabet has an equivalent value of 3. It explains what gematria is. Gematria is 3, means 3. So thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on Shalom TV.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.